Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We're going to get started here in just another minute to give folks a few more minutes to log on. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to have a few more folks joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and kick us off because we have a lot of great stuff to get to, and I know that we're all eager to hear from our guests today. So hi, everyone. My name is Claire Haley. I'm the Strategic Communications Director for the Atlanta History Center. We're absolutely thrilled to be welcoming you to today's author talk. So there's a couple firsts here that I'm really excited about. The first is that this is actually our first international author talk. So Gwen Strauss is joining us from France today, which is really cool. And Alison and Jennifer, both in the rest of us in the good old USA. So it's just really exciting that we're able to do this. A definite plus of the virtual age. And also it's our first lunchtime author talk series. So we're looking for feedback on what y'all think of this time. So you can find my email address in the Zoom invitation that you got to this talk. So feel free to drop me any comments. We'll also be sending out a survey because we're looking to see if this is something that we should do time that's good for people, we should do more of in the future. So I'm going to briefly introduce today's guests and then turn it over to our moderator today, Alison. So first of all, we are welcoming Gwen Strauss. So she is going to be talking about her newest book, The Nine, the true story of a band of women who survived the worst of Nazi Germany. And she is a prolific poem, short story, and essay writer, and that's appeared in numerous journals, including the New Republic, London Sunday Times, New England Review, and Kenyon Review. And she's published a collection of poetry entitled Trail of Stones. So she was born and spent her early years in Haiti, and she currently lives in southern France, where she is the director of the Artist Residency Program at the Dora Maar House. We're also joined today by Jennifer Rosner. She is the author of the book, The Yellow Bird Sings, which is the book that she'll be discussing with us this afternoon. And it has been called, quote, exquisite, heart-rendering, and absolutely beautiful, unnecessary novel by the New York Times Book Review and a finalist for the 2020 National Jewish Book Award. So she's previously published books including the memoir, If a Tree Falls, A Family's Quest to Hear and to Be Heard, a Sidney Taylor Book Award notable. In addition to writing, she teaches philosophy, as she received her BA from Columbia University and PhD from Stanford. They're in conversation today with Alison Law. So if you've been around the Atlanta book scene for any amount of time, you've probably seen Alison around before. She is an unapologetic book pusher, author enabler, and executive producer and host behind the fantastic literary podcast, Literary Atlanta, and that ran from 2017 to 2019. So she's interviewed internationally best-selling authors all over the place across Atlanta, including here at Atlanta History Center, Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, and elsewhere. She has 30 years of experience in broadcast journalism, creative writing, and marketing. And she also is helps out with the Decatur Book Festival. So she served as an associate program director in media relations for the Decatur Book Festival. And she's an advisor for the Decatur Writers Studio and the Georgia Center for the Book. So you can find both of these books available for purchase at Karis Books and More, which I will post a link to. We highly encourage you to support your local independent bookstore. And I'm now going to get out of the way and turn it over to Alison, Jennifer, and Gwen. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Atlanta History Center. And thank you, everybody who is joining us. I hope you have a cold beverage where you are, maybe a little bite to eat during lunchtime, and plenty of questions and curiosity about the World War II time period. We have these great books that I saw Jennifer had beautifully displayed on her bookcase in the back.
Good job, Jennifer.
This is Gwen's book, The Nine, and then this is Jennifer's book, The Yellow Bird Sings. So I figured before we went back to World War II, Gwen and Jennifer, that we would just kind of let everybody know where we are today, and maybe you could share some musings on what it's like to have a book come out in the world when we are going through a pandemic. Gwen, you want to start us off?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Really, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Alison and Lovely to see Jennifer again, and thank you to the Atlanta History Center. Um, so I'm speaking from southern France, where I live and work, and it's 6 p.m. It's been a really hot day. We're in the middle of our first canicule of the year. So even though up until now everybody was complaining about how it wasn't hot yet, and now everyone's complaining about how hot it is, it just quickly went over. Um, it's been an interesting year, to say the least. The first part of the first part of lockdown, that was a here was a very serious lockdown in March of 2020, and that was actually well timed for me because I was finishing the final copy edits of the book, and that gave me time to really focus on the nitty details of the actual structure of the lot, at a sentence level. So in a weird way, I was sort of grateful, just for my own personal working rhythm, because normally I have a busy job running this artist residency program. But it's also interesting, just to really quickly, it's also just really interesting to be thinking about another great catastrophe in a way in the world, and how people survived and went through it and got through it, and the different strategies of how we can surmount different struggles and suffering.
It definitely puts the subject matter that both of you are dealing with into kind of some contemporary perspective, a time of great transformation and change around the world. And Jennifer, have you been thinking about that and all as it pertains to the yellow birds?
I have. So again, I thank you for so much for having me. It's really great to be here. I'm in Northampton, Massachusetts, and when I think about this pandemic that kind of closed everyone in for quite a while, I mean, I have to say, since my character was, I have a mom and child who are closed into this tiny space, they can't move much, they shouldn't speak. I mean, on the one hand, it did give perspective. I think people understood at least the sense of being shut in, but it also showed that we had the luck of being able to speak out loud, and we had, we could get access to food, and we could do puzzles and etc. So it was interesting because it was this sort of sense of the closure, but then also realizing how limited, to be in hiding on top of that would have been. As an author, I mean, it was really interesting. My book came out right as the pandemic hit. I had like a couple in-person events, and then everything shut down, and it all pivoted to Zoom, which initially was, sad because I was supposed to go to London, I was going to California, I was flying all around, and it all got canceled. But then there were these, silver linings, because I started I was doing a book club for some people in New Zealand, and and also in UK, and different things like that. So it opened up other opportunities. But yeah, it definitely had thematic resonance. And the other thing I noticed was that around here, people would just all of a sudden notice that there are birds singing, or, they were aware of nature in a way that I think they weren't so aware. And it struck me because the people, we'll get into this later, but the hidden children, who I interviewed with, one of the things that it seemed got them through these such difficult times was this appreciation of beauty wherever they could find it. And I just noticed how all of us were kind of pivoting to notice things that, we just barely paid attention when we were so busy. So that was another resonance that I thought was interesting.
I'm glad that you said that, because that's definitely something.
Hang on, you're muted. There you go.
You got me now? Yeah, that's definitely something that I noticed when there was less traffic. There was more bird song. There were more sounds of nature. And so yes, it is amazing. And I wonder too, let's go ahead, Jennifer, and talk about your book. And I want to make really clear to our audience that this is fiction, whereas Gwen's book is nonfiction. And we can talk about the choice to write a novel versus a nonfiction account. But will you give us kind of an introduction to the story of Rosa and Shira?
Sure. Yeah, so The Yellowbird Sings is about this mother and her 5-year-old daughter, Shira, and they're hiding for their lives in a farmer's barn in Poland during World War II. And the girl, Shira, is musical. And so she feels it pulsing in her. She hears it in her head. But in the barn, she has to be completely silent. She ends up conjuring a bird who can sing out the music she hears in her head. And her mother, in this effort to pass what are really, not just, it's like minute by minute, hour, day, so much time. She's whispering this story of a brave girl and her bird who avert threats and find safety. And yet outside this barn, it's nothing, it's incredibly threatening and there's no safety. And eventually, the mom has to make a very difficult choice about whether to keep her daughter with her. They need to find a new hiding spot, or whether to, put her daughter in another safe haven alone. And that's kind of how things move from this tight space together in the barn to, a time when, they get on the move essentially. And that's kind of the overarching thing. And I think it's, about unbreakable bonds during wartime and mother-daughter relationships. And again, the place of creativity and also beauty and human survival.
Ooh, definitely, definitely. And Gwen, both of you will have to forgive me I'm going to do some terrible Polish and French pronunciations of the characters and then the real life women of the 9. But Gwen, you wrote this about your great aunt. Is it Tante Hélène?
Tante Hélène. Yeah.
Tante Hélène, yes, much better pronunciation. Much more beautiful in your mouth. But you said that your family always knew that she had this historical past, like she was well regarded, had received awards before, but it wasn't until a lunch conversation that you really just knew that you had to record her history. What happened during this lunch?
Yeah, don't worry about the pronunciation. Some of the women, I found out their pronunciation later after, so I was mispronouncing them. And so Tante Hélène was known in the family. We knew that she had been in the resistance, and she was, as I said, she was decorated, but I didn't know anyway, the extent of what she had done. And really late in her life, I think she was in her 80s, at a lunch, she was sitting next to me, it was with my grandmother, and she sort of spontaneously started to talk about the war, about her being in the resistance, about her getting arrested. And then she told this sort of extraordinary story about this escape with her and a group of women from the Nazi slave labor camp, and walking across Germany for 10 days to find US troops. And it was the first I had ever heard of that. I didn't actually even know that she had been in Germany, had been deported to Germany. I knew that she suffered from depression. I knew, sort of unspoken in the way in the family, that it was probably had to do with what she'd gone through in the war and the trauma. And she was brilliant. She spoke all these languages. She was an engineer. She had a whole career as an engineer. But there was this past that she had that was I wouldn't say taboo is almost too strong a word, but somehow in the family it was impolite to bring it up. And suddenly she was talking about it, and so I asked if I could come back and record the story completely. I didn't have an idea that I would write about it. It was just that I thought, this is an amazing story. I don't want it to be lost. I just wanted to capture it. And she agreed. And I went back with another aunt. We did it together. We recorded her talking. We had a long conversation with her. And then we made a transcript, which she then later edited. And then that was it. I mean, I wasn't planning on going back to it for that was in 2002. And I've since found out that, because I've spoken a bit to her daughter, quite a bit to her daughter, that was a real transformative moment for her. That she was struggling a lot near the end of her life with all that she'd been through, and to actually talk about it was very helpful. And I think to talk about someone who wasn't that close to her, I wasn't that close to her. I'm I'm a niece, but she's my great aunt, so it's 2 generations away, and I didn't grow up with her, So in a way, I might have been a safe witness that she didn't have to protect from. I think she felt she had to protect her daughter from the truth of what she'd been through, or I think that's what a lot of the survivors felt. So I was someone she could talk to because I wasn't that close to her, in a sense.
Yeah. And I loved her response to you, which is so often what we hear from survivors or people who have been through wartime, which is like, what's the point? Why do I why is this story, why is it even
Right.
worth talking about?
Right.
Um,
Right.
why do you think it's important? And one of our attendees even asked a question that I am wondering. World War II continues to be a very popular topic for both historical fiction and for nonfiction. In your case, Gwen, why do you think it continues to intrigue us?
I think the story is important, and I think it took me writing the story to figure out why it's important, because I had a lot of ambivalence about this whole period and writing about it, and whether I was allowed to write about it, and visiting these sites. I was all messed up in my mind. So the process of writing it, one of the things that I really did come to terms with, and I really feel so grateful that I saw, and I feel honored that I learned, was that telling the stories, bearing witness, is an essential act as a human being, and it's like central to our humanity. When we tell each other's stories, when we listen to each other's stories, and when we hold them and we pass them down, it anchors us, and it makes us human. It keeps us connected. So I grew to understand that in a way that I didn't understand before doing this project. I think why World War II is so compelling for us is it was really this moment, I feel like, where there was a kind of clear, the world was kind of on a balance between this, fascism, this kind of totalitarian sort of machine evil, a bureaucratic machine of evil, and democracy. And there was a kind of and it was the whole world, and it was I think so. I think it has a kind of good and bad that seems sort of clear in a way initially, and then of course the Holocaust and all that happened and all the suffering is so profound that we're even now still finding out really what happened. There were whole groups of people that weren't acknowledged as being part of the genocide until really recently. So there's a lot of excavation to do, and also I think it was in some ways a kind of pure dividing line. Now, one of the things I hope with my story, and one of the things I learned from my great aunt, is not all Germans are bad. It wasn't that clear of black and white. Not all the people in the resistance were good. It's more complicated, but it's much more nuanced, as everything really is in human stories. But I think as a large canvas, it kind of as a story writ large, it has that kind of pure story to it. There was this moment 5 years when everything could have gone another way, and it didn't, because of this the kind of humanity that was able to hold together and help each other and survive. I mean, that's my opinion.
I love it. Jennifer, I know that you came to your story in kind of a roundabout way. I think it was at a book event where you first were inspired to find out more about the hidden children.
Yes. It was really interesting. I was at a book event for my memoir about deafness, which is a story. I have 2 deaf daughters, and we learned of great aunts in my ancestry who lived in a little shtetl in Austria, who were, these were deaf women who were in probably a pretty ostracized situation. And I think I was moved to be writing these juxtaposing stories of 2 deaf sisters. And at the book event, I was talking about, how we were encouraging our children to speak with, they had hearing technology, cochlear implants and hearing aids. And we made this decision to try for the, like spoken language route. And so I was saying how happy we were whenever they vocalized. And then a woman in the audience, told me about her childhood experience being completely silent, having to stay silent. She was hiding in a shoemaker's attic with her mom during the war, and just trying to imagine what it must have been like for that child having to be silent, and then for this mom having to essentially make her child vanish, what that kind of might be like. And I think it had a lot of emotional resonances that were very close and had nothing to do with the Holocaust. I mean, it was about hearing and being heard in ways in which I don't think I felt so heard, and how I really wanted to hear my children. So it was, I think her story resonated with some of my own issues in this certain way. But also I was just so moved by learning the details of her story, which in some ways were stranger than fiction. And from meeting her, I met many other hidden children, and then I was in that world. But I wanted to mention something, when Gwen mentioned that her great aunt, that they weren't so close. I found that I could, find hidden children to interview, but there are two in my own town who asked not, I said, can we meet? And they said no. And it's like they were willing to talk maybe to an audience of high school students, but they had a script. They wouldn't want to sit and just have me ask any question because it was just, they needed to stay on a script. It was too hard. And so I think every person who's gone through trauma like this, is he able to share under very certain circumstances, and you just have to honor how they need to be careful with their emotional
Absolutely.
life and resilience. And
Yeah, I am glad that you mentioned that too, Jennifer, because both of you in your books talk about how so often in stories about wartime, we're caught up in what happens during that period, and then what gets lost is what happens after all of the turmoil. And like, how do you go back to living a quote unquote normal life after you've been a French resistance fighter who escaped, Ravensbrück? Or how do you, try to live a quote unquote normal life after you have survived being sent to a concentration camp? Or, so can either of you talk about, maybe Gwen, you can talk about, or Jennifer, you could talk about what you learned from the people that you interviewed in terms of like trauma, and how they it really had repercussions, not just on them, but on their children and their other generations.
Yeah. You go first, Jennifer.
Okay. Well, I have to say, so I had this sort of interview by interview experience, and everyone's story was very different. Some of the repercussions had to do with being so, I would say alienated, but it was confusion. There were so many feelings, like about religion, for instance, about kind of how to integrate the past with the present. And I'd go into someone's house and they would seem so well integrated, like they've built this new beautiful life. There's photographs of their grandchildren's bar mitzvahs, etc. And then you start talking, you're there for 5 hours, and by the time you're done, you realize they just opened this box they haven't opened for anyone else. And all these feelings are coming out. And it was kind of startling and striking, because the difference between the first conversation, the initial kind of conversation, and then where we were at the end, this one man, for instance, said to me after, you hear his story of being he was hoping and wanting so much to get reunited with his parents. And then he said to me, if you told me my mom was in the other room, I wouldn't go in there. He just couldn't manage it anymore. It's been this kind of hope, it's just too painful. And, there was a woman also who spoke to me about how her father had gotten taken away first in their family. And so it was her and her mom in a barn. And she was probably 80 years old when we were talking. And she said, we never saw my father's body and we don't know exactly what happened. So there's still a chance. And I'm thinking, I mean, I don't think there really is a chance, but like, it was that kind of thing without having really resolved it. So there were so many details like that where you realize that this is going on, 75 years later, 80, whatever, these many years later, that they're dealing with this. And the thing also I should just say is that when we hear of traumas like children separated from their families, at borders, etc., all I think is, and in 75 years, those children are still going to be unresolved with this unresolved pain, because that was such a profound feature of what I found in interviewing people. It didn't really recede. They might have kind of boxed it away and moved forward, but it was so painful.
Yeah, I was really, I had a few experiences of really seeing the intergenerational trauma, how it like hit the next generation, because I was also interviewing mostly the descendants of the women. I mean, I was, because by the time I wrote my book, all of the women had passed away. And that was super powerful for me, because I sort of thought, well, that it's their story and their children, but the children had their own. Even when they would always begin, just like you were saying, Jennifer, they begin saying like, I don't really know anything, and they never told me anything, I don't know what I can tell you. And then a couple hours into the conversation, you're really close to the bone, and they're telling you a lot of stuff, first of all, about what happened, but also how they lived the experience of their parents. A lot of them, both parents were survivors, because a lot of the women married other survivors. So they had this experience of knowing that something terrible had happened to their parents, knowing that their parents had gone through some terrible suffering, but not actually it being unspoken, and then not actually knowing what it is. And then many of them sort of reenacting it in a way, or having that trauma be part of their lives. So one of the women's children, she had 4 children, and 3 of them, two killed themselves. One ended up in a mental hospital, and one wouldn't be interviewed and was sort of barely functional. And the parents were both survivors, and the parents were fine in a way, but they weren't fine. And the children really, I think, had this sort of unspoken grief that nobody could tell them. They were just so sad, but they didn't know what that sadness was, I think it's to me, it's also just really powerful about the histories of wars, because World War I in a lot of ways led to World War II. At least, you can see how these traumas keep going, and there's just this sort of imperative that we somehow talk about it and tell the story so that we can hopefully heal. And I was going to say something Jennifer said, that a lot of the women in my group didn't speak about it until very late in life. Somehow, as they were approaching death, and maybe then they were able to function for a long time. They had careers, and they had children, and then suddenly later in their lives, when they had a bit more time, maybe it started to become imperative that they talk about it, or that they feel it, that they started to actually have the psychological effects showing up. My aunt, for example, really had a depression hit later in her life, and I think it was kind of like, but at the same time, when I talked to my aunt, and when I talked to, they thought about the war every day of their life. Like she says to Elon in this interview that was filmed, I never told anyone, but I always think about it. So it was a haunting that they kept silent about, which of course that's transmitted to the children without them recognizing it. It's really complicated how these traumas, carry on anyway.
It really is, and I think your book definitely speaks to that intergenerational, at the DNA level trauma that we have come to learn about. I want to mention again that the books are both available from our Atlanta independent bookstore, Karis Books and More, the 9. Gwen, we had a question come in from one of our attendees asking, do you think that women today are capable of the same strength and solidarity that the 9 exhibited so long ago? Maybe we should talk about the 9 knew your aunt by her code name in the French Resistance, which was Christine. Who were these 8 other remarkable women? Yeah, I know that's an impossible question. But
it took me a book, but first of all, I'm just going to say, of course, I think women still are capable. In fact, I think we all are, men and women. So they were all young. That was the thing that was kind of astonishing for me. They were all in their 20s. Some of them joined the resistance as young as 17. The oldest one was 29. They were 6 French, 2 Dutch, and 1 Spanish. Some of them knew each other, like some of them had known each other before, but they met in Ravensbrück and in Leipzig at the labor camp, the slave labor camp, and they formed a bond, as people did, as I think as soldiers do in war as well, because they knew they could trust each other and they could count on each other, and they did help each other in dire moments of they held each other up, I would say, in a way. And they're each very different. They're from different socioeconomic classes. They're from different backgrounds and different levels of education, which I also found kind of lovely and astonishing about the group. It's not an obvious group in a way, and yet it's really obvious once you start to know them, and once I started learning more and more about them. But when I first started the story, I didn't even know their names. I didn't know that my aunt Hélène was known as Christine, but even on the Nazi list that I got, she's listed as Christine Podliasky. So she kept her nom de guerre and her real name secret. Her nom de guerre was the name she was known by, and her real name, the Nazis didn't ever find out. So that's kind of interesting how, because in one of the lists that I was given, someone wrote Hélène in pencil, and I found out later it was another woman in the camp with her. So it must have been someone she was close to. She told her name to that woman, Odile Pipol. And so when I first started to find out their names, I just knew their first names: Lon, Gigi, Zinka, Zaza, Mena, Jackie, I don't know who I'm forgetting. But I had to slowly figure out who those people were, find out their last names, find out. And that was the detective work, which was actually really fun. If in another life, I'll be a private detective.
I love that. I should say the beauty of the book too is like right in the beginning, you have a list of the 9 and all of their different nicknames and where they're from, descriptions of them. There are also, I love this about when I read biographies or nonfiction books too, the different maps of where they were to kind of orient you. And then there are pictures too, prisoners marching to Dachau.
Yeah, I got a photo of each one of the women. Yeah.
Usually in the beginning of the chapter, you get to see photos of them as well. So that it's just really a remarkable book.
I was worried because there's so many people that, I needed to help the reader follow who's who. So it's, that was a bit, me and my editor were trying to figure out all the different ways we could help the reader through, hold the 9 as a group.
Yeah. Jennifer, I couldn't help when reading The Yellow Bird Sings, think about one of the first books that introduced me as a child to the horrors of World War II, which is The Diary of Anne Frank. I'm wondering, that's obviously a nonfiction book, but I would love for you to tell us about your decision to write historical fiction, to make this a novel.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things to say. I had written a memoir and thought, I think I want to try fiction, just because the memoir was so personal and had so much about not just my daughters and I and my husband, our family, but also my relationship with my mom. And it was very revelatory in a lot of ways. And it was one of those things where I think I needed to kind of step back a little bit into a different version of writing. And I also feel that sometimes you can really achieve certain truths through fiction that you almost can't in nonfiction. That sounds very strange, but there are emotional truths that I was able to kind of convey. Maybe that I didn't know if I would have necessarily, if I were sort of bound by anyone's particular story rather than able to invent anything I want. And so I don't know. I think that I found that fiction is probably the way I want to go in general when I have stories I want to tell. And like I was saying about the interviews with hidden children, I mean, there was so much incredible resilience, and it was so inspiring, honestly. And there was also all kinds of luck in the world. And, this question about whether people would be as resilient or women would band together, et cetera. It's interesting. One of the people I interviewed was a man who said that he was describing that he was in a school attic with his mom, and his mom taught him geography and how to read in this attic. And meanwhile, these other children were able to play outside and go to school, et cetera. He was stuck and looking through these tiny slats of, pinpricks of light through the attic wall. And yet he described his time there as cocooned in love, which I thought was this unbelievable testament to his mom. I mean, how she made that happen, that he felt cocooned in love. And I also wanted to mention, just to kind of pull threads of our conversation together, is that he also said to me, we had an event together. It was a really special event because, I got to be there with someone I'd interviewed. And right beforehand, it was, during the pandemic. And I said, how are you doing? And he said, well, I spent my youth hiding you know, hiding, you know, in war, and I'm spending my elder years hiding from a virus. And I was thinking about how much this how much COVID must have been affecting survivors, especially those who had hidden, because it's just such a kind of weird resonance there. Yeah, and I guess so the other thing I wanted to say is, you know, about something else Gwen had mentioned about how not all Germans were bad and some of the you know, resistance people weren't the best, et cetera. And there was this texture. And I wanted to really convey that. So, you know, I have characters who are really round. You know, they're like you know, they're bringing potatoes and socks on the one hand, and they're also coming nightly to visit at the barn. And you know, there's just conflicts for everyone. You know, the mom loves her daughter dearly and yet is grateful for a moment where maybe she's not needing to share her food, or someone's not right on her body that moment in terms of like neediness, or, you know, just these different moments that are really human moments. And I think that, you know, in terms of the heroes, you know, it's very hard to be heroic across the board. You know, I think people might do heroic acts and then at times kind of want payment or want recognition, or it's complicated, you know, and we are in a situation where we haven't faced this particular moral challenge that people during that time did face. And, you know, there were people who more or less rose to the challenge and more or less didn't. But there was this really gray and blurry area in between as well, where you rose on the one hand and didn't rise on the other, you know, et cetera. And I think that's really important because, you know, it's humbling because, you know, you want to believe of yourself that you might rise across a board, you know, but you have never been given this particular challenge. Would you hide someone in your home, you know, or in your barn or whatever, at peril to your family, at cost to your family, you know, et cetera, and all these different things. And I just feel like there's so much moral question raised by these scenarios. And while I don't know, I mean, these stories they're so powerful because they are about our humanity. And I feel like I don't know, they're telling us who we have been and who we are and who we may be again, you know, and we're looking at history happening now with different symptoms or, you know, anti-Semitic things happening, et cetera. And how are we responding, really? Are we really noticing? Are we paying attention? Are we preparing? Are we responding, et cetera? And so I don't know, I think that there's so many reasons to be thinking about this time period. And also because it's sort of a weirdly distant war to children, to a great many young people who barely really know what this is about.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, like you said, when using the word hero, that can be so loaded. It's easy to apply that term to a French resistance, full-time French resistance fighter, but there's also something beautiful in Rosa and Shira's story about how what they were doing by surviving was heroic. And I think that you develop such empathy because of the minute details that you have to focus on in order to tell the story of these people who cannot speak. Some of the details that you talk about, they really become keen observers of the world from this little crack in the barn wall where they're hiding, you know, initially. And though Shira is a 5-year-old girl, when we meet her, she's a very keen observer of what's happening with her mother and with the people that she sees outside. I'm wondering if you can talk about that phenomenon, if maybe that was what your intention was when you wrote it, that, you know, I can't speak, I've lost this one sense, so it heightens all of the other senses.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that becoming a mom of deaf children was such training for this kind of astute sensory radar that my character has, because, you know, when you have a deaf child, you start hearing every tiny little thing that they're not hearing, and grieving, actually, you know, or at least in our case, because we're hearers, it felt like a loss. Why aren't they hearing that little, like that little rustle of the leaves in the wind, or the way the trickling river is, you know, these tiny things, but they feel all of a sudden so laden. And I think it really shaped us. And as we were training them to be hearing, you know, it's like the water through the faucet. I hear that. Do you hear it? And the frying pan with the sizzle, I hear that. And, you know, sort of all that noticing, but then also having kids whose visual acuity is so intense and their olfactory experience is really quite heightened. I mean, scarily so. I should mention. They'll know you were there, you know, like through, you know, and so I don't know. I think that was a gift that like sort of strengthened my writing capacity. But yes, I was thinking carefully about the fact that they couldn't really speak, and they were in this tiny space, and they, you know, there were survivors who could barely move after these tiny, you know, being confined in spaces like this. So there was so much there, and yet these minds are so like incredible. I mean, of the people I was interviewing, it's like they're these brilliant, like Nobel Prize winning chemist and an engineer, an asteroid aero, you know, I mean, there were these minds like stuck in this silence, without really all that much stimulation except what someone could whisper to them. And yet, you know, after like while biting on these with these spongy teeth that were like rotting in this thing, they managed to go back and get their like career in order. I mean, it was just this unbelievable, I don't know, it's just inspiring, and you know, the resilience is really quite incredible.
Yeah, that was the word.
I'm not sure I
right
even
on the tip
answered
of
your
my
question.
tongue. Resilience. It is amazing to have had that beginning. Gwen, it looks like
And I also
someone.
just want to say, I want to add that Jennifer's writing is really beautiful. I mean, there's this gorgeous writing that brings that really deeply alive. I have big admiration for that.
Definitely. It's definitely
That's so
an admiration society here. I was telling her that it was like a devastating, but just amazing, beautiful story. Gwen, you have members of your fan club here. Someone named Anita Thomas is with us today, and she said that 3 years ago, when you had dinner together in Provence, that you shared your book with her and her daughter, and she was fascinated. Is this going to become a movie?
Hi, Bo Peep. I'm glad you're there on the other side of this, you know, whatever. We're in the process of making it a TV series. I'm really lucky to be working with this just fabulous writer named Ella Hickson. She's a British playwright, and it's been optioned by a British a production company called Kudos. But you know, who knows? I feel like it would be great, and I would love it if it could happen. But I'm super grateful for having the book, and even grateful for having had this incredible process of writing it and learning it. It was really, if I say this to people, you know, there's things you do in life when you just keep running against walls, and then there's times in life when you have a project and doors open all the time. This book was like that. Every time I got stuck, when I couldn't figure out who somebody was, this weird coincidence, it was as if I was being guided to tell this story.
Can you give us an example, Gwen?
Oh, there's so many, but well, one of them I sort of made an allusion to. I had been given a Nazi list by one of the archivists at the Leipzig Memorial Museum in Leipzig. She had sent me the Nazi list, a few pages of it that had my aunt's name on it, as Christine Podliasky, with in some kind of pencil written next to it, and her name Hélène, but was very hard to read because it was a photocopy of a scan of a photocopy of a scan, you know, and that had just been sent to me over the internet. It was a document that was kind of grainy and hard to read. Then I decided eventually that I had to really go to the archives, and you have to choose what you're going to see in the archives way ahead of time. You have to reserve the document, and I had no idea. I'd never really worked in an archive before, you know, and it's like a needle in a haystack because the French Historical Archive has so much about the Second World War, and you know. But I chose one thing, which was a dossier, a file of a woman, because she happened to be in the same camp. I could have chosen anything, and there was literally hundreds of things I could have chosen. I chose that thing for my first. You could only choose like 3 documents at a time or something. 3 file cabinets at a time. I get there, and I go through the whole process, which took me a while because I didn't know how to do it. And I had the wrong thing. I had a pen and not a pencil. And, anyway, I was a total amateur newbie, Next to me, I saw people with portable scanners and everything. Anyway, they roll out this file, which is an old box. You open it up, and I pull out these papers, and the first thing that I pull out is the list I've been looking at, only it's the original list. And the reason I have the original list is that woman's document her name is Odette Pilpol. She stole the list. It's the reason why that list exists. It would have been burned. And she was this incredible woman who was in the same block dormitory with these 9 women, who was a kind of born archivist, record keeper. And she just was driven to record what had happened. And she made lists, and she wrote, and she made maps, and she's just sort of this extraordinary person, really. And she deserves her own book. But it was this, someone said, you need help? Here's the original list, because from that list, I was able to find most of the other women once I had the original. And the documents that she had, and then I found the story of how she stole it. It was basically she stayed behind in the camp after they went out on the death march at the very risk of her life in order to steal this document. And I felt like in order for me to open it up one day, however many years later, 75 years later, and pull it out, and there it was in my hands. And, it helped me tell this story, but it also, I know that list, because it's a 400-page list, helped so many Polish families find what had happened to their mothers and daughters, and they had her. She's one of the righteous among nations, because that list was so key. So that's one of them, but there's many like that. It was really a joyous experience. I felt like, wow.
Signs from the universe, right? You're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jennifer, someone is asking about the musicality of the book, and Rosa and the rest of her family, they're musicians. We learn through the narrative, and then it makes sense that Shira is also musical. Why the decision to introduce music into the book?
There were a variety of reasons. I mean, one was this sense that that art was saving people. I mean, I really felt that way. But also there's a personal connection that my father had played violin every day of his life. And I saw it as this connection to his Jewish roots. Like I could see he was composing music and playing, and then I studied voice and played with him. And there was just this connective power of music that I knew very, very personally. But also when I learned of my great aunts who were deaf in this shtetl, I learned this detail about them, which is that they, at night when it would be dark and they wouldn't hear, they tied a string from their wrist to their babies so that if the baby cried or fussed, they would feel a tug on their arm and they'd wake to care for their child. And this was like this connection, or like a mothering through the darkness, a string of connection. And I chose the violin both for my father but also for my great aunts, because to me Shira like opens the window a crack and plays her violin, hoping that somehow her mom is going to hear her. And it was just this connective tissue. And one of the things that you guys were also talking about, I was thinking about how one thing I love about writing is that things just get turned on their head. You think you're doing one thing and then you realize it's something else entirely, and you learn so much about yourself. So I think when I first wrote, my memoir, I thought I was writing about whether my daughters would hear, and then ultimately learned that it was whether I would hear them, whether I would have a string from my wrist to my babies, and whether that would be possible. And the same thing kind of happened in The Yellowbird Sings, where, there's so much longing there, a longing for a mom to be connected to her child and a longing for a child to be connected to her mom. And, there were just things where I was coming with one premise and realizing that what I was really working on was something else. And, but yeah, the music, I thought that, it was this way of staying connected through the separations.
I like that. Well, I know we're getting close to the end here, but I have one question for both of you. Gwen, maybe you can take this one first. How did you personally deal with your own feelings during the writing process, the research process, because I'm sure it could be a little traumatic. And, you know, Gwen, because you've worked on this book for almost 20 years, it seems like as time passes, it seems to, you feel this like importance in representing your family and these true people correctly. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, I think the material, some of the material is quite difficult, and I'm sure that Jennifer, well, I know she experienced that too as well, talking to hidden children. In a way, I really wanted to not overdo the horrors because I have a, you know, I just don't want this kind of.
Oh, oops, did she freeze?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe she'll be back in a minute. That is the beauty of live Zoom calls. But yeah,
I can jump in and then we'll let her finish her answer. It was quite difficult emotionally sometimes, and I think that it also took me a long time to write this novel, and I think that had to do with needing to take breaks and just needing to pace because you know, it's just a lot emotionally to manage. And so yeah, I think that's actually sort of the fact is that, you know, I think that you want to bring it, you want to approach it, you know, with a kind of, I don't know, like an openness. And the more you read, you might start closing down. And that's actually one of the things that, you know, why these stories are important is because they humanize, but also like you identify with a particular person and want to know that story rather than like this glossed over large numbers, you know, etc. So then when you really are working with individual characters or, you know, relatives or whatever, you know, you realize that your pacing is really important so that you can really give them their story as it's due.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that that's an important thing to consider. Maybe Gwen will come back at the last minute to say hello to us, but I just wanted to remind you we're talking to Jennifer Rosner about The Yellow Bird Sings, which is available from our independent bookstore, one of the oldest and dearest feminist bookstores in the country, Caris Books and More. And
sorry, it's Provence. Our internet's not great.
That's no problem. We're so glad. It was a nice cliffhanger. You're about to tell us all about what it's like and how you took care of yourself in the almost 20 years that you worked on this book and its subject matter.
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel like I just want to also say that I feel like there's just, and I think Jennifer also spoke to that there's so many beautiful stories of resilience. There's so many gorgeous stories of kindness and generosity and solidarity. And that we kind of can lose track of that. Like, it's really easy to talk about the sort of the machine of the whole Nazi killing apparatus, but then there's just amazing individual, beautiful people who do things in moments of great peril to themselves, and that just is overwhelmingly beautiful. I mean, that to me kind of was, I feel like the other side of our humanity is that we're able to be nice to each other, really, we're able to sacrifice for each other, we're able to really love each other and to, you know, recognize the other and to stick together. So those stories of solidarity and kindness and generosity were equally powerful for me, and I feel like in many ways there's a lot of hope in my book because of that.
I agree. This is the 9. I mean, the women are just incredible. The stories and the friendships that they develop over time with each other. It's just amazing. I'm wondering, since your next career is as a private eye or detective now, like what is your what have you learned from the research process that you're going to use in your next artistic endeavor?
I love doing research, and so I think I'm going to do another kind of research based nonfiction book because I just thought it was so much fun. I learned a lot. I mean, first of all, I learned how to work in archives, and I learned how to. I think I'm better at interviewing. I was pretty lousy at it when I started. I messed up the recording machine, and everything. And also just to stick with it. You think you know everything. You think you've read it, every document. And then if you read it again, or if you just look, suddenly there's something you didn't even notice that you knew but didn't know. So I think I've learned this sort of the power of just, if it's something that interests me enough, you stay with it, and it can really open up.
Yeah. And Jennifer, you did a lot of first-person interviews for this novel. What did you most enjoy or learn from the research process?
Well, yeah, I mean, making these relationships was really meaningful. Honestly, I feel like I became close and connected to the people I interviewed, and then also I felt I was so lucky. I had a guide who read my manuscript in advance, and I went to Poland with my eldest daughter, and he took us to areas that really like brought alive these settings. So, you're there as a novelist in your house in Massachusetts, and you're imagining the barn and the convent and whatever. And then he brought us to these areas, and we learned so much about it. I mean, about how it really would be to hide a person, where you see how close things are, and how kind of curious the neighbors are, and how the convent really smells, and how like what it sounds like to walk on that floor, things like that, like all these specific details that were so rich and full. And we went to this area of woods where partisans had camped, and you saw this dense forest, and you just can't imagine digging with your hands to like make a burrow to sleep in. I mean, all these kinds of details just came alive. And then also, speaking of generosity, I mean, I got to consult with these people. Like, I worked with a forest tracker about how my character could move through the woods without leaving tracks, and a mushroom forager about what she might find. But more than anything, this masterclass violinist, because I had a prodigy on my hands, and I needed to understand how she would practice and what she would play, and all the kind of details of prodigy development, etc. And what piece could go where. Would she really learn Flight of the Bumblebees before she would, all these sort of things that while I may know a little, I didn't know enough, and so there was so much generosity in that regard too. And as I move into my next novel, there's a lot of other components too, and I find that I need to talk to an archaeologist, and then I need to talk to, it all like leads you in these different directions. So it's kind of really super enriching. I feel like I've gotten to like fall into these different sort of worlds that I didn't know anything about, and they open up to you.
I completely agree. I think that's the great thing about writing, is you get to dip into all these different things and learn from all these different people. And yeah, I 100% right with you on that.
Yeah.
So Gwen, you're on to another nonfiction project, and Jennifer, you're going fiction.
That's right. Yeah. That's our story. Those are our stories, and we're sticking with them.
Yeah.
That's right. We're going to hold
It'll
them.
be very funny if it switches, if I come out with a novel and you come in. Yeah.
But in the meantime, we're so grateful to you for spending some time with us today and sharing The Nine and The Yellow Bird Sings with us. These are two really incredible stories, especially for all of us who are still so intrigued and eager to learn about the different people in the World War II era. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And thank you to Alison and Jennifer and Gwen. Can I just go ahead and put a hold on whenever y'all's next books come out? We would love to have you back. That was such a wonderful conversation. I know that I had so many insights, and one of them that I just wanted to bring up, Gwen, is you're talking about your experience, going to an archive and what that was like. If anyone in the audience has, a research project you're working on, like, we have a really fantastic archival staff here at Atlanta History Center. I have to brag on them a little bit. So I'm posting that information in the chat. Like, please reach out to us and let us know, how we can help you with that project. But again, Jennifer, Gwen, thank you both so much. And if you enjoyed today's talk, we have lots on the books. You can go to atlantahistorycenter.com to find all of that information. I'll just mention one we have coming up tomorrow evening with Curtis Wilkie, and he'll be in conversation with Hank Klibanoff, and they'll be discussing the book When Evil Lived in Laurel. So it's a really, really intriguing kind of true true story about Laurel, Mississippi, and the chapter of the Ku Klux Klan and the FBI investigation into that. So that's tomorrow night, June 17th at 7 p.m. here back on Zoom for free. So please join us if you can. Jennifer, Gwen, Allison, thank you all so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.